Okay, welcome back to our discussion of externalities, and we're talking about externalities in production, right? Whenever an external cost exists, a private firm will not allocate its resources and operate a plant in such a way to maximize social welfare. In other words, when there's an external cost, producers will overproduce. So we would be better off in society if they produce less. If pollution costs are external, firms will produce too much. They'll overproduce. Now, external costs exist when social costs differ from private costs. Aha, let's look at this. External costs are equal to the difference between social costs and private costs. Now, social costs are the total cost of producing something. Now, if there are no externalities, social costs and private costs are equal. But when there's an externality, there's a divergence. Let's look at this. So you can see external cost is social cost minus private cost. But if external costs are zero, then social costs equal private costs. Again, social costs are the full resource costs to society of producing something. Private costs are just the costs to the market participants. So if there are no externalities, these two are equal. But if there's an externality, there's a divergence between private costs and social costs. And the market does not allocate resources efficiently when there's an external cost present because firms will overproduce. And that leads to what we call a market failure. So here's an example of the private cost is the marginal cost curve in red. Well, if there's a third party paying for some of these costs, it's not reflected in the private costs. And this means that the social cost, which is the social cost, is going to equal private costs plus the externality. And that's what this is going to equal social cost. So if you added on the externality, which is this amount right here, that's going to mean this is the social cost curve, which is going to be the externality and the private cost. So you can see here, if the firm only faces the private cost, they're going to be producing where MR equals MC, and they're going to be producing Q sub P, right? Well, if they faced all costs and there were no externality, they would be facing a new marginal cost curve, and then they would be producing where MR equals MC, and they would be producing a lower rate of output. So consumers and producers tend to maximize their personal welfare, right? And when people, for example, from a household point of view, when people use vacant lots as open dumps, guess what? They could avoid costs. It costs money to dispose of your waste properly. You benefit, but when you dump your waste in an empty lot, somebody's got to clean that up. That somebody's got to pay a price to do that. So can you see how you are pushing your costs onto somebody else? So for example, let's look at smoking, for example. Smoking gives some benefit to the smoker, but it also imposes costs to the smoker, health risks, right? But it also imposes costs on third parties through secondhand smoke. So the book, The Price of Smoking, provides a comprehensive lifestyle estimate of the social cost of smoking. This was done by taking the present value of the life cycle stream of private, external, and quasi-external costs for a 24-year-old smoker. So let's take a look at this. The net present value, that's NPV, social cost of a 24-year-old smoker was considered to be $220,000 for men and $106,000 for women. These calculations account for the purchase of the cigarettes as well as the excise taxes that they pay. It's estimated that the social cost of smoking in 2000 was around $40 a pack. That's how much you would have to pay in the year 2000 if you took into account all costs. And that's made up of about $33 in private costs borne by the individual, primarily through substantially shortened lifespan, and another $5.50 of quasi-external costs. This is borne by a smoker's family through increased health costs, right? Your family's health is going to be affected negatively, and that's a cost. And then there's finally $1.50 in external costs by society, who have to pay for things like extra insurance because the smokers are more costly to take care of, which drives up healthcare costs. So how can you correct for these externalities? Well, one, there are two general strategies for environmental protection. One is you could alter market incentives, make it more costly to produce, and then people would voluntarily produce less. Or you could bypass market incentives and simply tell them, hey, stop doing what you're doing. So the optimal rate of pollution occurs when the marginal benefit of cleaning up one more unit of pollution equals the marginal cost of doing so. In other words, you can clean up you can clean up the environment, but remember, cleaning up the environment comes at a cost. If your benefit exceeds the cost, then do it. But if the costs get so high that cleaning up a little bit more pollution could be too costly. So the optimal rate is not zero pollution, because getting pollution to zero may be far too costly. Let's try an exercise here. So cleaning up the heavy pollution has, let's say, has marginal benefits greater than marginal cost. Then you should do it. As marginal benefits fall, marginal costs start to increase. So as you keep cleaning up more and more, marginal benefits fall and these start to increase. The analysis will shift to the point where the next unit of cleanup has a marginal benefit less than marginal cost, then you shouldn't do any more cleanup. So in this exercise, what we could do here, I could ask you, imagine getting deeply covered with mud up to your armpits. Okay, you're dirty now. Here we've got cleaning yourself up, no cleanup, completely clean. And here's the benefits and costs of that cleanup. So now you start cleaning up. So step one, take a hose and wash up as much mud as you can. And when you start cleaning up initially, you get a big benefit and there's not much cost. Now, step two is so here your step two, soap and water, and you wash the clothes vigorously. Now, washing the clothes and scrubbing them, your costs of cleaning are starting to increase, right? Then, step three, get a brush and spend a lot of time working out the mud out of the nooks and crannies of your skin and your clothing. This is coming at an even higher cost to you. Step four, take a Q-tip and toothpicks and dig out the dirt under your fingernails and the traces of mud in your clothing. That's even at a higher cost. So you can see here, if you tracked the benefits and the costs, you could see that they proceed on different paths. Look at this. So you could see the first mud that you clean up yields high benefits and low costs. But as you clean up more and more and more, costs start to rise and the benefit of being a little extra clean is starting to fall. You can see here, once you get to a certain amount of cleanliness, it doesn't make sense to clean up any further because the costs of cleaning up more have increased and the benefits have decreased. So cleaning up the heavy pollution has a marginal benefit greater than a marginal cost, then it should be done. As marginal benefits fall, marginal cost rises. The analysis will shift to the point where the next unit of cleanup has a marginal benefit less than marginal cost and should not be done. So in the next video, we're going to be talking about, well, actually, we have enough time to talk about it here. Market-based incentives means that you are going to simply change the benefits and costs of pollution and allow people to make their own decisions as to should they or should they not pollute more. For example, emission charges. An emission charge is a fee imposed on polluters. We're not saying that it's illegal to pollute. All we're saying is you've got to pay for your pollution. An emission charge is an increase in the private marginal cost and encourages lower output and cleaner technology. An emission charge might persuade firms to basically incur higher fixed costs. If emission charges are high enough, firms will install new technologies to avoid the emission charges. So you can see there's an incentive to pollute less. Here is one way to understand the effects of an emission charge on behavior. Let's say in the next exam, I'm going to institute a calculator tax. Students can bring calculators, but they must pay every time they use the calculator. So the question is, if you had to pay every time to use a calculator, who would use it? Well, the people who needed help most would, and the people who sometimes use the calculator just to double check things may avoid using it to avoid paying the tax. So you can see here an emission charge is a way to shift the private marginal cost curve up. So the private marginal cost curve now lies on top of the social marginal cost curve, which will cause firms to produce less. A producer has no incentive to use recycled materials unless they offer superior cost efficiency and greater profits. So a bonus that emission charges offer is an increased incentive for the recycling of materials. Raising the price consumers pay for scarce resources encourages them to use them less. Again, these are all examples of market-based incentives. Imposing a fine or liability for cleanup costs changes the incentive structure and causes firms to voluntarily produce less. One very innovative solution is tradable pollution permits. You're actually creating an asset in pollution. A tradable pollution permit lets firms purchase the right to continue to pollute. The key to the success of polluting permits is that they are bought and sold among private firms. So let's go back to our calculator example. Instead of a tax on a calculator usage, I'm going to issue 3 permits to each student to use their calculator. Given each students have different math skills, can you see how a market for a calculator will soon develop? This is the system for government-set pollution standards. Firms that reduce pollution by more than the standard have excessive permits, and they could trade them to firms who need more permits. The principal advantage of pollution permits is the incentive to minimize the cost of pollution control. You're not telling firms how to reduce pollution. You're simply giving them an incentive to do so. Entrepreneurs now have an incentive to discover cheaper methods for pollution abatement. And here, I'm going to go over this example where you have two polluters, a copper smelter and electric utility. They both emit pollution. And this are 1 ton reduction, 2 ton reduction, 3 ton reduction of emissions. But it costs each firm different amount to reduce pollution. Let's say there is a mandatory reduction of 4 tons each, and you say, okay, to be fair, each firm has to reduce 2 tons. Well, you can see here, it's going to cost the copper smelter $450 to reduce theirs, and it's going to cost the electric utility $250 for a total cost of $700 to reduce 4 tons of pollution. The question is, could this be done more cheaply? Could you reduce 4 tons of pollution at a lower cost than $700? Well, let's reduce the 4 tons based upon who could reduce it at a more efficient cost. Okay, let's look at the first ton. Who is the most efficient at reducing the first ton? You could see that the electric utility can reduce 1 ton for $100 compared to $200 of the copper smelter. The second ton, again, the electric utility can reduce it for $150. That's still lower than the 200 tons for the first reduction for the copper smelter. Well, for the third ton, it's now the copper smelter who could reduce it at a lower cost than the electric utility. And finally, the fourth ton, it goes back to the electric utility who could reduce it at 210 compared to 250 for the copper smelter. Now, look at the total cost of reduction of 4 tons. We were able to reduce it at a lower cost because we based it upon who could reduce it at a lower cost. So in the next video, we'll talk about the actual market in pollution permits that exists today.